Hello, and welcome to another home mastering masterclass Q&A hangout. Everything seems to be working. I will just head over across to YouTube and double check. Yep, I can hear myself in my headphones, which is always confusing, but proves that everything is working. Good. So I've just posted a link in the comments to the right-hand side of the video if you would like to join Stephen and I in the hangout. Don't feel you have to. You can just be there for posterity, prove you were here by grimacing occasionally and pretending to laugh at my lame jokes. Or if you have a question, then you're very welcome to do that. Now, I have lots of questions this evening. So, Stephen, unless you had any particular questions before we get started.
Not right now, but I do have a couple.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, in that case, I'll dive into these and I will attempt to be slightly less rambly than my usual self in order to try and get through all of these. So the first one I was going to answer is from Yevgeny. I hope I pronounced that vaguely correctly. So he has it's a fairly long question, but a general theme. How would you recommend setting the right amount of sub-low frequencies for home mastering? When I work on a song, I make decisions considering the non-linear distribution of low frequencies, room modes, and the long reverb time at low frequencies. But it's difficult to identify this problem in the early stages of the production process, recording and mixing, so I often have to deal with it at the mastering stage. Would you advise dealing with low end in headphones or using a low-pass filter when comparing with reference tracks? Can you give me some tips on managing low end and setting the proper balance at the mastering stage in an acoustically untreated room at low frequencies? It's really, really hard, to be honest. It's one of the biggest challenges. So my personal experience of working in an untreated room was when the studio that I used to work at moved buildings. They had studwork studios, double skin studios built in a warehouse space, and the lease was up, and they'd fallen out with their landlord, so they had to move to another warehouse space and rebuild the studios from the ground up. And because of the way the leases work, they couldn't get any overlap. So there was a period of a month or two where we had to make do using just one of the other rooms in the office complex part of the building, and it was a nightmare. I mean, the funny thing is, we set everything up and we put in as much acoustic treatment. We'd salvaged a ton of acoustic treatment from the other place, and we filled up the corners with bundles of fiberglass and did all of the stuff that not fiberglass, but the dense rock wool stuff that goes in the walls. All the things that you're supposed to do, and we kind of thought that it was okay. It sounded pretty good. You would listen to the stuff that you'd worked on and thought, yeah, that sounds about right. What I found was it was incredibly difficult to do our job. Now, that was going from rooms that had been set up for 10 or 15 years and working really well. They'd been tuned over time. We all knew them inside out. Going to kind of an unknown space, it was kind of at the worst of all options. And to be honest, we basically kind of shut things down for a bit. We didn't do a great deal of work. There was compiling and editing and all kinds of things that we could do, but the hardcore mastering work, especially for the bigger clients, just had to be put on hold until the new studio was finished. So I'd be lying if I don't have any magical solution for working. I mean, this is not an ideal room, but it sounds surprisingly good, and that's because of the acoustic treatment that I've put in here. And I think because I got lucky, because the wall that you can't see, in fact it's not a wall, there's a big window in front of me, and where this used to be the garage, and so there's just a very flimsy studwork wall there. So I basically think of this room as like being like a bass gun. It kind of shoots all of the low frequencies out onto the cricket pitch out there, and that means I don't have to worry about them being in the room with me. But I don't really have any. That wasn't by design. That was luck. So I don't have any right for this room to sound as good as it does. And what you're saying. Actually, because Yevgeny's got some other questions that I put later because I want to they came in later, and I want to make sure that I give everybody an even kind of, or on a fair crack at the whip. But in fact, okay, I'm going to combine this other question, which is, based on your experience, how big is the difference in detail between headphones and monitors in professional practice? How much does it depend on the price of both? What effect does acoustics and loudness have on detail in monitors? For example, I hear reverb tails less than a certain level in inexpensive headphones, but they completely disappear in my studio monitors and hi-fi speakers no matter how close I am to them, i.e. the room's acoustics don't affect how loud they sound. So big complicated issue. I mean, the bottom line is, the great thing about headphones, as I say as part of the course, is that they take the room out of the equation. So whatever problems there are with the room, you replace them with whatever problems you might have with your headphones. And if you use something like SonarWorks, or some kind of headphone calibration software, you can reduce the number of problems you have with your headphones. They still need to have a full frequency represented. You know, if there's no 50 hertz, say, being generated by the headphones, and no amount of EQ is going to be able to put that back in. If they don't go above 15 kilohertz, you're never going to hear 18. But you don't have to spend that much. I mean, you know, these Sennheiser HD650s, you can get these for $250 online if you look carefully, and the 600s, I believe, probably you can get for $200. That's still quite a lot of money. That's more than some people spend on monitors. But honestly, I think it's unrealistic to expect that you're going to be able to do a great job mastering if you haven't spent something like that much money. And then you've got SonarWorks on top of that. That's another, well, the headphone version is $99, I think, so that's not hugely expensive. So the great thing about headphones is that they're a known quantity. If you have a pair of, especially if you get them measured by SonarWorks, but even if you have a pair that they have in their database, you know that the frequency response of those has been corrected as much as possible, and you don't have the room to deal with. So in that sense, you can trust what you're hearing on your headphones. There's other stuff that happens though with headphones. You don't get the crosstalk between the two ears because you have the sound being fed directly into each ear. There's software that emulates that, but I don't like it. So you have to learn what that means. You have to learn how stuff that sounds a particular way on headphones sounds when you put it on speakers in a room. In some ways, the room feedback can be useful, because if the room is reasonably under control, it reveals stuff about the sound. You know, if things really start to hoot in here at around I don't know what frequency it is. There's some stuff in the low bass, 170, 140, I guess, those kind of frequencies. Then that raises alarm bells with me. So that information, that kind of problem with the room tells me something, and I think that's why lots of people prefer speakers, is because it's actually useful to have that interaction of the sound with the room. There's a temptation with headphones to listen too loud, and you do hear lots more detail. I mean, one of the things could be the frequency response. If you have a pair of headphones where the frequency response just goes, let's say the high frequency response is pushed, or if you have a pair, God forbid, of Beats, and the low frequency is pushed, that's going to make you hear things that are in those frequency ranges more. And that can be challenging to deal with. So I guess what I'm saying is, it depends. There's a real, you're walking a knife edge. And I think the ideal is probably to do both. So, for example, if you're mixing and recording on your monitors, maybe when you first start mastering, you should listen on headphones. Go with your gut reaction on the headphones, then bring it back to the speakers and listen to, maybe take it out into the real world, make some notes about things that you're concerned about, bring it back. Can you hear it on the headphones? And then kind of iterate around that. I mean, one of my favorite sayings is that a man with a watch may know what the time is, but a man with two is never sure. And that's doubly true of monitoring. So you need to be beware of bringing too many variables in. But if you're listening to stuff on systems that you know really well, the feedback you can get can be useful. Now, if let's say something sounds fine on headphones, and then you take it out and it sounds really tinny and brittle at 3 kilohertz on a pair of earbuds, if you come back and listen again in the studio and on your headphones and it sounds that way, you can hear that quality, then by all means address it. But if you come back and think, no, I don't hear that at all, then it's time to try it in a few other places and see whether you hear it anywhere else. And if you're just generally not hearing it except on the earbuds, it's the earbuds. And the same for a problem that you might hear from the monitors or wherever. So, okay, let me try and wrap this up. It's really hard working in an untreated room. So my number one piece of advice is to somehow get some acoustic treatment. It kind of doesn't matter what quality of monitors you have. Kind of, almost any monitors will be improved by some acoustic treatment. Maybe you can, if it's a room that kind of has a dual use, maybe there's some that you can put away in a cupboard and bring out when you need them. Or you can buy panels like the ones that I've got on the walls and they have art printed on them. So maybe the acoustic treatment could become part of the look of the room, maybe. If by hook or by crook you can get some acoustic treatment into the room, you're not going to regret it. It will save you time. It'll save you heartache. But I realize that's not appropriate for everybody. So in that case, headphones. And I do think you need to spend a reasonable amount of money on headphones. This is the cheapest pair that I've used that I think can give reliable results. 600s are a little bit cheaper. They might work. There are probably others. I just haven't tested them. As the price goes down, you're going to get more distortion. You're going to get more phase weirdness, which the EQ can't necessarily correct. You're going to get less linear response at different loudness levels, so that above and beyond what we perceive as a change in sound, the headphones might actually sound different at louder or quieter levels. And the same is true of cheaper monitors as well. So I hope, Yevgeny, there's something in there that helps in some way. With all of these things, it depends on the price, but not as much as you might think. I've heard sets of speakers that cost tens of thousands of pounds that I don't think sound as good as speakers that cost only a few £1,000s. So price doesn't guarantee performance, but you probably do have to pay a reasonable amount of money to get something where the performance is there. And it's not worth skimping and saving. A better improving your monitoring setup will make far more difference to the quality of the results you can get than buying a new plugin or a new piece of gear or a new mic or any of those things. So yeah, there you go. Hopefully that's helpful. And you had some other questions, Evgeny, which I'll come back to later if I have time, hopefully. Josh, while this is more specifically a mixing question, as a mastering engineer, do you have any tips on how one can increase the perceived loudness of a song whilst preserving the transients and the dynamic range? Is the use of saturation the way to go, and what advice can you offer with regards to sensible application? So you can't increase the perceived loudness of the song whilst preserving transients and dynamic range. Okay, I guess that's not true. If you had something where the peaks weren't kind of compromised at all, you could use EQ. Certain EQ shapes might make it sound louder or quieter. Actually, there's a ton of things you can do, and too many to go into on this podcast, this hangout. But we did a podcast episode on it, which I believe is called "What is Loudness?" Let me check that for you. So there's all kinds of stuff that you can, there's sounding loud and measuring loud. So an explosion will always sound loud, even if you turn it down so that it measures very quietly. There's something in it that clues us up. There are all kinds of things about explosions. There's a distorted electric guitar will tend to sound loud, even though it's not. A gently strummed acoustic guitar will tend to sound quiet, even if you play it at very high levels. So there's all kinds of intrinsic stuff in the sound that can affect our perception of loudness. Yeah, there's definitely an episode called What is Loudness? Yeah. Episode 31 of the Mastering Show. I won't repeat everything. Try listening to that. Come back to me if it doesn't help. That's the first thing to say. Then the second thing to say is if your goal is to push the level up and get the LUFS up and be loud in that sense, you have to compromise. There's, you know, a certain amount of clipping, a certain amount of limiting, and all the rest of it can make it seem that you're doing it cleanly. The strategies that I'm teaching on the course, having a balanced EQ, combining compression and limiting with the right EQ settings and all the rest of it, will help you get there cleanly. Maybe you don't want to get there cleanly, you want to push it hard so that you get some of those artifacts of being loud, like a little bit of distortion, like a little bit of pumping, that kind of stuff. But it's basically all trickery. At the point where you're starting to limit the peaks, or dramatic, limit the peaks to the point that you can't do it cleanly. And when I say limit, I just mean control. Prevent them from going into hitting zero. It's all about compromise. So, but your question was about mixing and how to achieve a loud sound, and that I would say is all about arrangement. It's all about balance. It's all about. Again, it's much too big of a topic to cover in a single Q&A. It's all that. But to give you an example of what won't sound loud, if you don't use any compression at all, and which some people kind of have misinterpreted what I'm saying and think that that's what I'm telling them to do, which is not. If you don't compress the bass guitar, if you don't compress the vocal, then you will leave yourself too much work to be done at the mastering stage, and you'll never achieve it. Even if you balance things very, very carefully, there is you've got to think about the properties of loud sounds. What is it that makes them sound loud? I mean, one of them, if we're in the real world and you're in a very loud environment, our ears start to clamp down. There's actually a form of natural compression. The muscles around the eardrum start to tighten up to protect our ears. I think there's a way in which that psychoacoustic effect interacts with our perception of loudness as well. So I think the golden rule is to okay, so there's a video. Let me see if I can find out what the video, how I'm gonna. Oh, actually, I could paste the link into the comments for you guys. Let's do that first. So I'll paste in here's the podcast episode. I can see you guys are talking to me. Okay, I'll come and read those in a bit. And then the next one. EQ, loudness, production advice. There's a video that I did a while back for the YouTube channel. There we go. How EQ can make your music sound louder using less compression and limiting. That kind of demonstrates how crucial it is to have a balanced EQ. So I recommend taking a look at that one as well. So I've pasted both of those into the comments. Hopefully there'll be something there that helps you out. Okay, just to quickly address your question about saturation, Josh. I think the thing about saturation or soft clipping and any of those kind of things, they're basically adding distortion to the signal, and the distortion acts as a kind of proxy for the transient clarity that was there before you used it. So, one of the problems with a really clean limiter is that it controls the peaks, but it does it so cleanly that it just kind of takes all the life and sparkle out of the sound. If you bring some soft clipping in, so you actually bring a bit of distortion in, that can help make it seem like that effect was lessened. But if you go too far, it just ends up sounding crunchy and distorted and all the rest of it. So it can be a useful strategy, but I think saturation is one of my kind of pet hates at the moment. Everybody is just using so much of it for so many different things. They want it to add warmth, they want it to add density, they want it to add aggression, they want it to add clarity, and at the end of the day, it's all distortion. I use it myself. If I'm mastering a song and it measures loud enough on the meters, but I'm feeling like I keep wanting to crank it, that's maybe a signal that, maybe I need a little bit less of a clean gain boost there in order to get some of that feel. And you can also get more perceived punch, because if you think about a saturation effect or a clipping effect, soft clipping effect, you're kind of, everything's, rather than having an attack and release time, and a kind of controlled gain reduction, if you like, the stuff just slams up into them. and that helps keep all of that immediacy of the attack at the expense of adding distortion. So those kind of things. If you haven't already watched the video on clipping that I share at one point in the course, that might be worth a watch as well, Josh. Okay, let's pause for a second and just see what the comments were. Bring Me Sunshine says, you wouldn't want my face on the screen. Viola Moonshape says hello or hi. Hi. Upsides and downsides of 650s. They're quite pricey. They're not completely balanced. They're a bit of a bass boost, bit of a lack of very high end. But if you can add SonarWorks to them, that will solve that. And you can certainly get used to them. The advantages are they're a bit of an industry standard. Viola Moonshape is Michael. Hi, Michael. 800s are better. I haven't heard the 800s. I've heard the 800s are too make things sound too nice. I don't know whether that's true or not. I was going to say, I think one of the things about the 650s is they're a bit of an industry standard. You've got a good chance of finding them in other studios and other engineers. They're a bit like NS10s. You know what you're getting, whether good or bad. So, I mean, they work. That's the bottom line. You can make them work. So, I think there's some value in that.
These are okay.
What are they?
AKG K702s. They are cheap, but they're okay.
That's good. I've never really. I tried some sort of moderately priced AKGs a while ago and didn't like them, but I've never heard any of the high end stuff.
I think these are. If you go on their website, I think they retail at like $349, but you can get them really cheap. I got them on Amazon for under 100 quid.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah, that's really good. Okay, guys, well there you go. There's another possible. Are they fairly bass light?
Yeah, they are. They're a little. When I first got them, I thought they were a little bit toppy. They certainly don't have that big sort of boost, the kind of Beat style bass boost at all. So
no. I mean, you don't want that for mastery.
No.
Ideally, they want to be as flat as possible. But one of the things I like about the 650s is that the low end is very reliable. In particular, it's very even. And they're very low distortion as well. Another model I haven't tried yet that people are talking about a lot is the Audeze.
Oh yeah.
LCD-X.
Are they the ones that Glenn Schick uses? Because they're like $4,000.
No, I mean he has used a pair of Audeze. They're planar magnetic. They're different. They're not kind of moving coil magnetic drivers. They're not drivers like we're used to. They work in some other way that I don't fully understand yet. But they have various models, and some of them are like $4,000. But I think the LCD-X's are more like 300-400 pounds.
Okay.
So they're kind of more on a par with these, and I hear lots of people saying really good things about them, but I haven't heard them myself. Andrew is asking what we use to drive the headphones. I mean, I just have here. I've got a TC electronic interface, and the 650s are plugged into that. I did the videos for the masterclass course on a MacBook Pro with the 650s plugged straight into the headphone output on the MacBook Pro, because I wanted it to be a realistic representation. So you can get results that good in that way. I had a little bit of EQ on the master output to kind of a kind of poor man's SonarWorks. SonarWorks wasn't even available at that point. So I think people agonize too much about driving headphones. I mean, well, I say the only deep experience I have is the 650s, and they do remarkably well. I can plug them in directly into my iPhone, and they sound pretty good. I'm not aware of any blatant problems with them. I've not tested the distortion characteristics and all the rest of it. But in terms of getting a general balance, getting the EQ right, getting the overall level right, if you're not experimenting with wild distortion, so you're listening to something fairly clean, and you would notice if you're pushing it too hard, which is the other main thing you want to watch out for, I think they can work. So having said that, I'm sure there are benefits, with all of this stuff. There's always benefits to having the really high quality gear. So maybe one of these days I will get a really high quality DAC for my iPhone or whatever it is, and the wool will be pulled from my ears. But yeah, I think overall I would say people worry about this stuff a bit too much. Michael says he tried the Audeze and didn't like them. LCD-X are more like $1,000. Okay. I thought they were more affordable, but anyway, it's if you're paying a few £100s for a pair of headphones, I would, from a reputable brand, you should be getting something very, very usable. And again, if you're, if it's like, for me, I don't rely on the headphones because I'm relying on the monitors. If you're relying on the headphones, I think then you might need to think about playing around with SonarWorks. I mean, one thing you could do is download the demo of SonarWorks, try the average setting they have. So I've got a customized profile for the 650s for that specific pair of headphones, but they have average settings for 650s in general, and you could just try that and see how different it sounds to you, see whether it's going to make a difference. So that can be useful. Vlad is saying, how about the 600s? I haven't heard the 600s, but lots of people have said good things about them. I believe they're basically the same technology, the same drivers and electronics, but in a lower quality enclosure. How much effect that has on the sound, if any, I've seen frequency plots. They look like they have slightly different frequency responses, but I think definitely very usable. But the only thing I would say about that is that these days, when I look at prices, the 650s don't seem to be that much more than the 600s. There used to be quite a big difference between the two, and these days not so much. So my feeling is, if for an extra 50 quid you can get a pair of 650s, that's the way that I would go. But then that's the pair that I've used. There's a saying, ask any sound engineer what the best thing is, whatever it might be, speakers, headphones, compressor, plugins, mic, and he'll tell you what he's using. And that's the case. Nobody has, very few people have the time to go out and audition all of this stuff and form genuinely balanced opinions. It's, all of us go out there, look for something, find something that works, and then swear blind by it. And that's okay, providing you get a good result. There's no problem with that. But you have to take all of the recommendations, everything else, with a pinch of salt.
Did you say you use SonarWorks with those in your home setup? You said do you actually use it regularly?
If I'm in any doubt in here about the sound, which these days I'm not really, but especially back in the day when I was kind of first put this together and wasn't entirely sure that I could trust what I was hearing, I would. I mean, back then I didn't have SonarWorks, and I would check on the 650s. But now, if I'm going to use headphones and I'm listening to frequency balance, I would use SonarWorks, just so that the frequency response is completely or as flat as possible.
Cool. I checked the other day. It's like £90. It's like not a huge investment if it's going to make that much difference. In situations like this where your room isn't ideal or whatever.
Yeah, and then people ask me how much difference it makes. And what I would say is, so I had, they actually sent me that pair of 650s so that I could tell people what I thought, because I had a pair of 650s and they said, well, why don't you send them to us to be calibrated? And I was like, well, I don't want to be without a pair of headphones for a week or two, or however long. It's probably not that long. But so they sent me that pair and it was pre-calibrated. So previously, when I tried the average profile, I kind of thought, yeah, it's a bit better, but I still don't feel confident in what I'm hearing. And my test is to put stuff that I've mastered myself, that I know inside out. I have a kind of playlist of stuff that's my work, so that I know, it doesn't sound perfect at all, but I know what all the flaws are and what all the problems are. So I know where I am when I listen to it. And when I go somewhere new, that's what I'd put on to kind of acclimatize myself to the system. And the difference was with the 650, with the average setting using SonarWorks, I would put it on, I would kind of think, okay, yeah, that's the bass is a little bit more balanced, but the top end still doesn't sound quite right. And whereas if I listen to this playlist with Sonarworks, with the calibrated thing for that pair of headphones, and it's interesting. There are all kinds of little details between the left and the right, especially. Only a few dBs, like 1 dB, half a dB here, there, all the rest of it. But these tiny little details. So I put those on, and I kind of go, oh yeah, that sounds the way I expect it to. So that's kind of what I'm basing. I haven't actually mastered anything on them because I enjoy mastering on speakers. But I think that for me is a significant. But it's another one of those kind of, okay, it's probably a 5% difference, but it's an important 5%, maybe.
Well, it seems that, I mean, using headphones generally, if you're using them in that way to just do checking, okay, you're not actually doing sort of any sort of major work on them, you're just using them to quality check, then it seems like the Sonarworks stuff would be a good thing to have, because
I definitely think it's worth an experiment.
Yeah.
If I don't know how long the demo runs for, but if you can download the demo for free and you can play around with it and kind of, experiment. It's like, well, okay, so here are my thoughts listening to this piece of music without it. Here are my thoughts with. Now go out and listen on some other systems out in the world, and which one is closest? And if the Sonarworks kind of gives you more consistently valuable opinions, then it's worth having.
Cool.
Bring Me Sunshine. I'm not sure who you are, but Sonarworks Ref 4 HP edition. How does it work? I don't know what that is. Sorry. Drop me an email, and if I know, I can. I'll put some more information in there. Vlad, in here. Okay, this is a trade secret. You guys have to not tell. I have my B&W 602 hi-fi speakers. I bought them for my 30th birthday. Many moons ago. At the time, I went and I listened to a load of stuff, and I didn't expect to get B&W speakers, because I had B&W 801s, the really big, amazing B&W speakers in the studio, and I thought, well, I definitely, then nothing is ever going to be as good as those, so I don't want to have something where I'm constantly thinking, oh, they're inferior. And I was actually blown away with how the same test, right? Bunch of CDs that I had recorded, mixed and mastered myself, so stuff I knew inside out, listening to it on the little speakers, really, and I was like, okay, that sounds really good, and I had them kicking, and so when I set this room up, that was what I had, so I brought them in here and set them up, and have just been astonished at how useful and reliable they are. You can buy them, you can get them on eBay, and they're not very expensive. The 601s are also very good. So if you want some affordable monitors, I mean, these have been doing me proud. And I've, literally had people send me stuff going, I had this mastered at Abbey Road and I don't like the way it sounds. What do you think? And I listen to it on these and I tell them what I hear and they go, yes, that's it. And I do them a demo and they're pleased. So, but I do also have over £1,000 worth of acoustic treatment. You could build it yourself for a few £100. So, again, it doesn't have to be expensive. But without that, this room sounded horrendous. The day that that literally the day the paint went on the walls, I couldn't resist getting in here to try it out. And, to begin with, I thought, oh my God, what have I done? It's not like we spent the earth having this room converted from a garage into a room. But it was still a significant amount of money for us at the time. I thought, I've just wasted, this room is going to be unusable. I'm just going to have to accept that it's going to be a home office. And then the next day, the acoustic treatment arrived from GIK, and I put all of that in. It was like, oh, thank fuck for that. So, yeah, there you go. That's my little story. That's more than I was going to spend on that. Robbie, hi. How does it work? I think we've talked about this enough. Have a look. Actually, the Sonic Scoop podcast with Justin Coletti just had the head guy from Sonarworks on, and they talk about it for about an hour, how it works, the theory of it, why it's a good thing. So if you're interested, check that out. And I might get him as a guest on my podcast at some point as well. So yeah, I mean, there are people moaning about Sonarworks. I'm mentioning it because it's affordable, it's easily available, and I've tested it and it kind of works. There's all kind of people, especially if you use it on monitors, because it does room correction as well, who will tell you, no, it's all bad. I haven't tested that myself. I don't know. There are much more expensive ways of doing the same thing. Are they better or not? Who knows? It's a whole can of worms. But my experience is, if you're using headphones, they can definitely help. Okay, Michael, your questions. When I look at the Dynamic Range database site, I notice a pattern in the sense that Radiohead's albums on vinyl are generally not as loud as their digitally distributed music, by which I think you mean that they have larger DR ratings. Is it so that music on vinyl is generally cleaner, less distorted, less compressed, with better dynamics? Sadly not. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that the Radiohead ones are not genuinely more dynamic on vinyl. I made a video about this, and at the time I didn't know why it was happening, but I can now tell you why. What I show in the video, it's called something like TT meter can't be used for vinyl. Yeah, why you can't measure vinyl with the TT meter. It's on the Production Advice site. I will paste it into the chat now. That's a demonstration of what I'm about to tell you about. Basically, any analog processing beyond a straight wire will affect the sound. In particular, it will affect the phase of different frequencies in the sound. And specific to vinyl, EQ, analog EQ, always changes the phase relationship. I don't mean the absolute phase. I mean the phase of the different frequencies with respect to each other. Can't really get into the details of why on the podcast. Not on this. I'm not quite entirely sure I understand it fully myself. But bottom line is there's a huge pre and de-emphasis curve that it gets applied. The RIAA curve gets applied to vinyl. So you basically it boosts all the highs and cuts all of the lows going onto the vinyl, and then coming off of the vinyl, it does the inverse to put it back, which is why the rumble is so loud often on vinyl, because you have the signal to noise ratio of the bass sounds is much lower because they were turned down before they went onto the vinyl, and then you boost all the EQ back up. And that's why footsteps, walking across the room if you haven't got a properly isolated turntable, you can hear footsteps coming through and all that kind of stuff. So short version, there's a huge amount of EQ involved in the reproduction and playback of vinyl. Therefore, there's a huge amount of phase change happening. It's called, I've forgotten what it's called, phase rotation. And it basically means that if you put, what happens is that because of the phase relationship of the peaks changes, the waveforms changes, the peak levels change. So it doesn't affect stuff that was fairly dynamic to begin with. If you have something that's DR14, so maybe -14, -16 LUFS, and you phase rotate it, the changes kind of don't tend to increase the peaks much. But if you have something, especially something that's been digitally limited, that's been on CD, let's say it's DR10 or DR8 or less, basically the more crushed the music going on gets, the more peaks pop back out when you phase rotate it. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a benefit or a genuine improvement. The way that I know that this is what's happening is I did a test where I applied a phase linear EQ with no change to a heavily limited signal, and nothing happened because phase linear EQ, digital EQ, can preserve the phase relationships. When I switched that to same EQ to analog mode with no boosts or gains, so a flat frequency response, the frequency response doesn't change at all, the peaks suddenly pop out. You get 2, 3, 4 more dBs of peak information apparently coming back into the signal. The sound doesn't change at all. You bypass it. I mean, it changes a tiny little bit, but I'm not sure that I could pick it out blind. Our ears are not very sensitive to that peak information, but it makes a big change to the waveform. So lots of vinyl is made from heavily limited, digitally limited digital sources. You put that heavily limited thing onto vinyl, you play it back, it looks more dynamic. The numbers measure more dynamic. all the vinyl enthusiasts on the TT database get really excited. It's not real. It's just an artifact of the process of the digital processing that went on in the first place, and then the analog processing involved in making a piece of vinyl. Sadly. And Radiohead, I believe, fall into that camp. I don't think the vinyl, but what I was going to say is that's not universally true, because your question, Michael, was, is it true that albums on vinyl are not generally as loud as digitally distributed music? It's not generally the case, but it is in some cases. And now I'm not going to be able to think of any good examples for you. No, nothing springs to mind, but there are examples out there where there have been genuinely more dynamic versions made for vinyl. The mastering engineer, there could be completely different mastering processes, could be completely different mastering engineers, or just people, because you can't take a really hot digital signal and cut it straight to vinyl at those levels, because you'll burn out the cutting head on the lathe, and they're expensive and they're like gold dust, and the vinyl cutting engineers won't do it. So if you give a vinyl cutting engineer a super compressed, super limited, clipped thing, they will just turn it down. They will also send you a polite email probably saying this isn't going to sound as good as it might, because vinyl's not really good at reproducing all of those kind of horribly hard clipped waveforms. It'd be much better if you took the final limiter off and reduced the clipping and all the rest of it. And when you do that, you get a cleaner vinyl cut, and you get something that's genuinely more dynamic. And there are releases out there that are like that, and they're worth seeking out, because in those cases the vinyl is going to sound probably significantly better than the CD. But it's not a general rule. I think enough said on that. Feel free to watch the video, see how you find it. Michael, next question. In my post on clipping, I wrote, hard digital clipping gives the highest apparent loudness, but also the most distortion and the biggest loss of low bass. I don't understand why hard clipping, or any clipping for that matter, affects a specific frequency band such as low bass more than other bands. Wouldn't the loudest instrument be influenced the most? The loudest instrument gets influenced first, but not necessarily the most. And I think the easiest way that I can, if you look at those waveforms in the video on clipping, imagine you've got a big bass sine wave like this. If you just shave the top off, it'll sound a little bit crunchy, but it'll still sound the same. As you gradually lower that threshold, it ends up looking more like a square wave, because those big smooth peaks have been chopped right off. And it actually becomes impossible for our ear to distinguish what the original fundamental frequency of the wave was, because the wave is so distorted. And that applies more to low frequencies than high frequencies, simply because if I think of an analogy, if you've used one of those frequency oscillators, you turn the bass down, it kind of gets down to, and it goes down and down and down, it becomes a pulse. And there comes a point where our ear doesn't distinguish it as a frequency. I think this is not a very scientific explanation, but I think something similar happens when you're clipping those waves. When you use soft clipping, the distortion that's generated is harmonic distortion, so it's related to that original frequency. So the new distortion frequencies that are created give our ears clues as to what the original frequency was. So the perception of pitch is maintained, even though the timbre of the sound is changed. Whereas hard digital clipping produces N harmonic distortion. The distortion components basically have nothing to do with the original frequency. They're just a mess, this mulch. And those don't give our ears any clues to what the original frequency was. So for me, you kind of feel like you lose the pitch of the note. Our perception of the fundamental frequencies and some of the higher harmonics starts to be lost. So that's why I made my comment. Like I say, that's a bit of a hand-wavy explanation, but hopefully that helps explain what I mean. I mean, I'm pretty confident you'll hear it if you try it. That kind of take some hip hop with a really big thundering bass line and just clip it really hard, and it kind of goes past that point where it starts to sound blown out, and then it just starts to sound thinner and weaker in the low end, because those frequencies are not doing anything recognizable. So I hope that helps. Now we've got some questions from James. When you mastered an album, when mastering an album, when would you choose to put processing on the master bus? Or do you always keep it on all the individual tracks and songs? Basically, well, you say mainly referring to limiting and possibly a tape plugin. Yeah. I mean, well, I would put anything that on the master bus. I would put something if I wanted it to apply to a whole album. So, for example, if I master something and send it off to the client, and they're like, "Yeah, I love it, but can we have a little bit more low end?" Probably the first thing I would try is just adding it on the master bus, because if that tweak works consistently over the rest of the songs, which it should, if the mastering was successful in bringing them all kind of in line with each other, it's quicker and easier for me. It's kind of more consistent. You know, the risk is if you go back and revisit every song individually, you'll actually end up wandering away from whatever cohesion it was you had in the first place. So I might apply a global EQ. I might apply a global stereo width process. My limiter is pretty much always, unless I want to have some specific creative effect with a limiter, you know, say I wanted to use an analog modeling, an analog modeled plugin of a classic limiter, say, on one song, then I could apply that to the individual clip. But generally, I mean, as I think I've explained in the course, the limiter is just there. It's just cleanly controlling the peaks. It's not really contributing massively to the overall sound. My whole strategy in mastering is to avoid kind of having to do it too heavily. So I don't need to fine tune the individual settings on that. It's just like, yeah, I find one I like, I'm mastering into it, so all the decisions I make are tailored to that limiter. And yes, a tape emulation, if I decided a whole album wanted some kind of emulation or saturation or that kind of thing, then I might apply it there. But basically, when I want it on all the songs instead of just one or two. Yep, you got there before me. Okay, preferred needle speed on the VU-MT. The default is fast, not normal. This didn't ring any bells with me. I've had a look. My version of the VU-MT doesn't have needle speed that I can find. If it's hidden away somewhere and you can tell me how to get there, I can go and have another look. But I think that means that I'm using the default. For what that's worth. But I like it. Well, I've never actually tested it against a real VU meter, but I think it's okay. It works. I'll keep an eye on the comments in case you know where that setting is and I've missed it. Another question from James. It's proven that online and offline rendering makes a sonic difference. For example, in Joe Gilder's offline versus real-time export videos. Is this because of the summing that happens with mixing and wouldn't impact mastering? Do you have a preference for exporting masters? Okay, this is a bit of a complicated issue because if it's the video of Joe's that I remember, he was talking about the fact that Studio One, when doing offline processing, will to be faster than real-time processing, will change the behavior of some plugins in order to achieve the speed. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, which is the one that I've personally experienced, is just some plugins have a random element to their sound. Oh, hang on, look, click on the Klanghelm logo for needle speed adjustments. I have to try this. Sorry, I shall come back to my previous answer. VOT, click on the Klanghelm logo. Ooh, hidden options screen. Okay, so my needle refresh rate is on fast, not normal. Oh wait, that's refresh rate. I think that's the animation. I think that's the number of frames per second of the animation, not to do with the way the needle responds. That's what I would have to check the manual on that, but I suspect that is simply so yeah, I would expect to I'll do some testing anyway. For what it's worth, mine's set to fast and I never even knew that option was there. Because I don't see that there's another, okay, sorry, I'll go back into that. There's another parameter in the VU-MT that does affect the needle ballistics, which is, you know, kind of how quickly the it responds to the signal. Come along. And that is in, if you click on the spanner symbol inside the needle display, then you get meter settings where you can choose. Oh, and Michael, you were asking me about the different, I have I have VU, DIN, BBC, EBU, Nordic, and RMS. Maybe one of you other guys can confirm. Michael couldn't find the EBU setting. Have they removed it in a later version? They might have done. But then you have a thing called VU mode, which says ideal, and there's VUMT1 and VUMT2. And I think that involves the actual reaction speed of the needle, I believe. So, anyway, there we go. Yeah, it could be the refresh rate. I might be wrong. Just that's my instinct. So back to, yeah, the non-real-time processing thing. So we had, does the host DAW change the processing depending on what it's doing, real-time versus an offline bounce? Do the plugins have a random element? So imagine a phaser or a vocal doubler, or the kind of more musical type effects, chorus, distortion, all of those kind of things. If you put the signal through it, does it do the exact same thing every time, or does it do the same kind of thing, but there's a random element to it to make it sound more analog, more real? That's a big reason, I think, for the differences a lot of people hear when they test this real-time versus non-real-time stuff. Is there another one? Anyway, okay. So I don't tend to use those processes in mastering. Wavelab I have tested. It doesn't matter how I bounce it, the files are always exactly the same. That's what I want from a mastering DAW. I would actually choose not to use Studio One because of the doubt that Joe has put in my mind about whether it would be doing the right thing, real time versus offline bounce. I mean, I worked for 10 or 15 years mastering in real time, recording things out and back through external gear, even when it was digital gear. And the software I had at the time, Sadie, which is still a professional piece of mastering software, the support for third-party plugins was poor. So it was, when the studio I used to work at closed down, which is why I ended up setting up this room here just so that I could keep working. It was really hard. The room the second set of rooms that I got to know so well over the years got ripped down and wasn't available to use because I had been dry hiring it, and I had to kind of start from scratch and figure out how to work all this stuff. And I moved over to Mac and started using a new piece of software and all the rest of it, building everything back up from the ground in terms of not what the results I wanted to achieve, but how I was achieving them. And that's kind of how I started on this journey towards the Home Mastering Masterclass, because I realized that actually all these things that I had been doing for years was possible with more affordable gear and more affordable setups. Anyway, what was the question? Yeah, so one of the benefits of all of that, there were lots of downsides to that. One of the benefits was I was able to use non-real-time processing. I love the fact that I can just open up a project I did 3 weeks ago, make a tweak, re-export a master, and know that it's going to be absolutely, I can trust it, it's reliable. I didn't have to listen through to it again. Not that I didn't enjoy listening through to the music, but it just saves time and it makes for more flexibility. So that was a definite bonus, and it's really important to me. So if I was going to, first test I was going to do, if I was considering using a new piece of software for mastering, would be if I bring a file in, export it with no processing, and then compare the original, are they bit for bit identical? If the answer is no, I'm not going to use it. And in some cases, the answer is not, is that there are changes. You just import a file, re-export the file, something changes. Even if it just adds dither, I want control of that. So that's one thing. But then the next thing would be this processing test. If I export the same file twice, does it sound identical? I would, dither is random every time, so I would accept dither noise, but nothing else. There are probably some other tests. So what was the question? Is it to do with summing? I don't think it's to do with the audio engines themselves. Well, it shouldn't be in a decently written piece of software. I suspect it's a combination of allocation of resources to produce the effect, to whatever that might be, whether it's faster than real-time bouncing or whether it's real-time, whatever it is. And then these random processes. I'm not bothered about the random processes. If I wanted to apply a reverb setting or something, so somebody gave me a really dry guitar recording and I decided it needed a bit of reverb to sweeten it up, and I had a reverb algorithm that had a random element to it, I'm comfortable with that. But I'm a control freak. I want to know everything that's happening, and I want all the changes to be because I chose to have them to happen, not because they just happened. Don't know whether that answers your question, James, but hopefully that's useful. Okay, this is an interesting one. Measuring tracks with more low end, EDM, etc. I'm finding that the VU and short-term LUFS results aren't consistent as they are with flatter EQ response music. My ear agrees much more with the short-term LUFS in terms of balancing tracks. I agree. I think I found a solution using the VUMT's deluxe high-pass filter at 50 Hz, 6 dB per octave, then using Reaper's FX dry-wet mix for the plugin at 0%, meaning the filter is inaudible and acts like an internal sidechain. With this engaged, I'm finding the results are much closer to the consistency between VU and short-term LUFS I get on flatter tracks, although I do turn the filter off for flatter tracks, as it can give the impression that the track is about a dB quieter than it really is for those. Is this inconsistency an observation you've made? Yes. Can you see any major flaws in this solution? No. I think there's a benefit to, VU meters are more and RMS meters as well, but particularly VU meters are more sensitive to bass than our ears really are. And with bass heavy music, that means you can get some more extreme looking responses on the meters than you might otherwise go for. But I tend to try and keep it under control anyway. I would usually find there's a balance point where the meter doesn't quite hit the stops. It sounds like there's enough bass for the genre. It works. The loudness is there. But I haven't had to ignore the meter completely, if that makes sense. But having said that, I used a real VU meter in a studio for 10 or 15 years. I just sat there with keeping an eye on it occasionally. It's the only thing to watch that was moving at that point. So my personal relationship with loudness and judging loudness is really tied up in how that needle works. For you guys coming to it fresh, you've got, I said this to Michael in response to a question he sent me by email. You've got the option to do it differently. You could set the VOMT to measure one of those other RMS or a different type of scale calibration. You can use an LUFS meter, whatever works for you. I don't see a major flaw with the solution you're suggesting. If it works, it works. I think I personally would be inclined to just use a short-term LUFS reading and take the VU meter with a pinch of salt. But if it works for you, then why not? The potential flaw is that that filter curve that you've found is going to be an approximation to what your ears do, but it is only an approximation. But then there's a filter curve in the LUFS meter. LUFS meter is basically an RMS meter with a filter curve applied to reflect the sensitivity of our ear to different frequencies, and one of those is to reduce the impact of bass. So you're absolutely right about how it works. And I've found that the LUFS values agree pretty closely with what my ears tell me, but not always. And the same is going to be true with your solution. But the other thing you might like to consider is, like I say, my version of the VUMT allows me to choose EBU, Electronics Broadcast Union. They are the ones who came up with the R128 loudness unit specification. That's where the definition of it comes from. So when you set the VUMT to EBU, it's giving you effectively short-term LUFS. I'm stuck with sticking to my guns with VU because, like I say, I've just used it for so long. But I think it would certainly make more sense if you had a needle meter that told you LUFS. That could be a great solution as well. So I hope that helps. Final question from James. The Sonox Oxford Inflator increases loudness without sacrificing sound quality or dynamic range. I kind of like what it does, but I'm also skeptical. Thoughts? I haven't used it, so I'm afraid I don't have anything helpful. There are people who swear by it. There are people who swear at it. I do think it's quite different from other. From what I understand, it's quite different from other limiter processes. I think it's capable of doing a lot of damage as well as a lot of good. And it's not I don't see it mastering engineers talking about it much, for what that's worth. Try it if you like it. Use it. Not the most helpful answer I've ever given, but that's the way that it is. Okay, let's catch up with some of your comments here. Yes, Bring Me Sunshine. That's Roddy, is that right? Robbie. Yes. Do null tests on your exports and bounces and choose the one that sounds best, i.e. silence, in terms of this whole thing of the different DAWs. That's certainly the kind of test you could do to test this stuff. If you... well, yes, that's the test that I do. So that's how I do my... Pretty sure I explain a null test in the course somewhere. If not, get back to me. But, well, no, null test. You have two versions of the file. You invert the polarity, flip the phase of one of them, play them back at the same time. If they're identical, the waves go in opposite directions and cancel out, and you get complete digital silence. That's the test. You know, I said about a new piece of software, a DAW, bring a file in, export it, then you compare the exported version with the original version by doing a null test. The meters should literally read nothing. If they kind of show you minus 96 odd and it's, or minus 60-ish and it's 16-bit, that's possibly dither noise. You can crank it up and take a listen and check. Anything else I would say is unacceptable. I'm not even sure that, like I said, I wouldn't even be happy with, well, I want to be able to turn dither off if necessary. So, but maybe that's an extreme point of view. But yeah, that's the test. And then the same with those real-time exports and bounces. But then you have to listen to the null test and go, well, okay, what differences am I hearing? Is this an EQ distance? Is it a distortion difference? Is it, am I hearing, I don't know, delays that weren't there before, or kind of chorusy effects that weren't there before? Because that will give you a clue as to what the differences are. But you have to be careful listening to null tests because they can be deceptive. They tell you that there is a difference. They're not always that helpful for telling you what the difference is. Yes, what was that? Okay, yes, that was a comment about null test. Right. Evgeny, back to your questions. We've done question 1. Question 2. The DR value in the TT meter. Does it make sense to use it now? Can it give some information that cannot be found in LUFS metrics and pro sound analyzers? Not if you have Dynameter, is the short answer, because Dynameter is my kind of taking the idea of the TT meter and running with it, doing what it does in an LUFS way, and I feel a more useful way. The thing that the TT meter measures is roughly speaking the crest factor, the difference between the peak and the RMS. Dynameter measures the difference between the peak and the short-term loudness. You can figure that stuff out yourself. If you're watching a short-term loudness meter and you know where your peaks are, you know that the higher the short-term loudness gets, the lower the difference between them gets, and therefore the lower the TT meter or Dynameter would read. But I made Dynameter because for me it's much more intuitive to just look at one thing, rather than kind of going, oh, that means this, just to see it there So I think there's value in that. There are also some other loudness meters that have implemented PSR, peak to short-term loudness ratio, which is what Dynameter measures. I haven't tested them, so I can't tell you whether the results are reliable, but the concept is useful. So if you have the TT meter and you don't have those things, especially I think the modern one has added an LUFS mode of operation. So that could certainly be useful. So yeah, if you have the TT meter and you don't have Dynameter, then there might be some value in you for you to just keep an eye. But you have to be careful. I mean, the reason I made it is because, again, the TT meter works on using RMS. RMS is much more sensitive to bass. So you could have an EDM track or that sounds quite reasonable. Doesn't sound horribly crushed, but it gives very low DR readings because the RMS level gets pushed up by all of the bass and it gives artificially low readings. So I think that's the downside to it. But again, just like I'm saying, don't use a TT meter because of that. But yes, you can use a VU meter despite the fact that it does the same thing. You know, I mean, it's what works for you. I think the risk with the TT meter is that it gives you a false impression. Having said that, if the goal is dynamic results, it's going to make you err on the side of caution, which probably is no bad thing. And then the last question from Yevgeny. FabFilter Pro Q has a tilt equalizer and a spectrograph. Does Pro Q has a spectrograph? I think I knew that. Maybe the Pro Q2. How about the Pro Q? No, I've got the Pro Q2. Pro Q3. Anyway, this is a rarity in other spectrum analyzers. Well, there are more of them are doing it. If the starting point is when all the frequencies are approximately equal, wouldn't it be easier to see without a visible tilt using 4 dBs per octave when all the frequencies of the same volume are displayed horizontally? Possibly. I came up with that recommendation of adjusting the tilt in the span EQ analyzer to make it look more like what I expected. Honestly, now come to think of it, I'm not sure. I don't know what the tilt is in the FabFilter. So yeah, the tilt thing is a matter of taste. You can use it, you can not use it, providing you know what you're aiming for in terms of the look on the analyzer. You're good. And okay, but here's the thing: you're not looking for the frequency. You're looking for the frequency to be approximately equal up to about 10K, and after that, I think for a natural acoustic sound, at least, they can start to roll off. And I think that's what I felt when I was using the span, because I hadn't used the span before. I wanted a free option that I could suggest to people doing the course, so that people didn't have to go and buy a ton of software. Span fit the bill, did the job, but I noticed when I was looking at the stuff that I was doing that if anything, I would see more high frequency content in it, and I felt that they sounded balanced frequency wise. And then I looked into the tilt thing and went, oh, okay, when I change it to 4.5, that kind of works for me, or whatever the value is that I recommend. So that's why I did it. But it's just that's exactly what I was talking about. Ask a sound engineer what the best way ask a mastering engineer what the best way to measure EQ is, and he'll tell you how he's doing it. That's how I done it, that it's worked for me, so I'm passing that on to you guys. But anything kind of that's sensible is going to work, and whatever you prefer works. So that's all of the questions that I was sent. Phew, got through it, and we're only just over the hour. Let's see if we can finish off, tidy up with any of these.
I can ask you a really boring question to finish off if you want, Ian.
I'm starting to yawn, so I might fall asleep if you do. Let's get these ones in the comments, and I'll come back to you. Robbie says, my last question: what happens on Dynamic Range Day? Thanks for the hangout. Good stuff as always. You're going to have to find out, Robbie. It's an online day of raising awareness of the loudness wars. So sharing memes, sharing videos, trying to flood social media with as many posts as possible, so that people kind of go, "What is this?" and find out about it. And I always do a webcast at 10:30 UK time. I have some cool people who I've asked to be guests this year. I don't know whether they will be able to make it and whether they will come or not, but if they do, that would be good. And then also probably a couple of other live streamy things throughout the day if I can. It's just a bit of fun, really. But this is going to be the 11th year. 2010 it started, and it's hard to believe. But yeah, come along, join in. James says, I've been looking at using the DDMF Meta plugin wrapper to oversample non-oversampled plugins, i.e. some of the Brainworks and Waves plugins. Any major downsides? Well, first of all, James, you should watch the FabFilter video that's done by the
Dan Worrell.
amazing guy. Thank you, Dan Worrell, about sample rates and aliasing and oversampling and all that kind of stuff, because I think he proves quite convincingly that the differences are a lot less than lots of people think they are in terms of aliasing versus non-aliased stuff, particularly because aliasing tends to be more of a problem with stuff that's got lots of distortion in it, and if you're putting lots of distortion in, that helps mask the aliasing that the distortion causes. But that's not to say this is not a good idea. What I don't know is the quality of the DDMF up and down sampling. You know, oversampling, the process of taking something at say 44.1, upsampling it to 96k, doing a little processing at 96k, and then sampling back down again. That's a great idea in theory, but it has to be done. I was going to say well, but it has to be done competently, I think. There are various things that can go wrong with that process that could mess things up. I can see there your comment. You're saying that you were inspired by Dan's video to test it. Let me know what you find out. Do some tests. You know, do the same tests that he did. He's a great guy. If you email him and ask him for his test files, he might well share them with you, and you could then run them through and compare to the results that he got. Any way to test the oversampling? Yeah, well, you need a plugin that introduces distortion components like the FabFilter Saturn that he uses, but any kind of hard clipper, so Kazrog K-Clip or Standard Clip or any of these, any clipper will introduce a ton of distortion harmonics, and then you need to compare what it looks like if you do it at 96 kilohertz with what you, as Dan does in the video, compare the high sample rate version with the low sample rate non-oversampled, and then the low sample rate oversampled, and see whether you see or hear any differences. Interesting idea. I don't think I knew that it could do that, actually. That's pretty cool. Yes, please do. Let me know what you find. But I do wonder whether it's worth the effort. You know, which plugins do you want to use? It might be easier if you want to use those plugins to just run things at a higher sample rate, because the other point that Dan is making in his video is about the processor overheads and the memory overheads and all the rest of it. In mastering, I kind of feel like maybe less of an option, maybe less of a problem for us running a few plugins in oversampling mode, or even running the whole session at a higher sample rate in order to not have to worry about aliasing on some of those plugins. Is less of a big deal than an entire mix running at 96k, for example, or whatever it might be. Right, Stephen, what's your really dull question, and then we can call it an evening.
It's I just wanted to know where we're at in March 2020 in terms of actually delivering work to clients, right? So people are still wanting DDP. So if they're using DDP to produce CDs, presumably the digital files that you would send, I'm just a little bit confused as to whether it is better to send 24-bit or 16-bit, essentially.
Okay. You're talking about for submission to streaming services?
Well, yeah, essentially, because if the DDP is going to deal with the CD and a sort of two 24-bit WAV files are going to deal with vinyl. The streaming services, like, yeah, where are we at?
Complicated question. Have you seen Dan's video about MP3 encoding and bit depth and dither?
No, I haven't actually.
Okay. I think it's called. Oh, I shared it on the blog because I thought it was so good. And I'll put the link.
Oh, or did I actually? Maybe I did.
So his original title was WTF is dither.
Oh, yes, I did watch
that. I kind
of
rebranded it by saying dither for MP3. Is it necessary? I'll put the link there for anybody who hasn't seen it. So what he's showing there is that if you have, if say you make an MP3, which, let's talk about MP3s, but any of these lossy streaming codecs, whatever, if you make one of those from a 24-bit file, you can actually encode it with greater resolution than the 16-bit file, but it has to be decoded correctly in order to get that benefit. If it's decoded incorrectly and is truncated, for example, rather than being properly dithered when it's decoded, then you end up with something that was worse than you started out with. So you have the potential to get something that's better in terms of the bit depth, but you also have the potential for it to be worse. So I'm a control freak. I'm not convinced that the benefits of the extra resolution in an MP3 file are audible. So I recommend you send 1644 everywhere except iTunes.
Okay.
Because I know that iTunes encoder and in fact the iTunes kind of playback chain, they've done all of this stuff right. They worked with Bob Katz and Bob Ludwig to get the mastered for iTunes stuff sorted. So I'm confident you can send them a 24-bit high sample rate file and they won't mess it up. I can't say the same for DistroKid and CD Baby and all of those other people. Even if the encoders that are being used by Spotify or YouTube or whoever are good and the decoders are good. I mean, one of the things is a lot of those services are telling you have to send 1644. It's kind of a shame because it'd be easier for us all to just export 24-bit versions and send those. But in my opinion, we're not there yet. That is just an opinion. Bob Katz actually says the exact opposite. He thinks we should be sending 24-bit because of the potential for a higher quality encode. I think the jury is out. I think give it another few years and they will get their shit together, hopefully, and it will be safe to send 24-bit files. But will you hear a benefit? I don't know. You know, for me, the artifacts introduced by even a 50% bitrate reduction or you know, going to sort of 320 kbps, that changes it introduces something like 10% distortion into the sound. You know, and as somebody said, how does that make sense when, you know, the thing that people love about SSL is it has 0.01% distortion. And it's not even musical sounding distortion, you know, it's this kind of psychoacoustic mush. So when that much distortion is being applied to the input signal, I think that, as far as I'm concerned, that has a much bigger influence on the sound that we hear than whether it was a 24-bit file or a 16-bit file to begin with.
Sure.
I might be wrong. I haven't actually done the tests myself. But even the tests that Dan does in his video, which is excellent, you know, he's turning all the really quiet stuff up and listening so that we can hear it. Whether that stuff is audible in a real listening situation or not, I don't know. So yeah, I like DDP because most people can't even open it. So there's less potential for them to mess it up than say a bin queue file or any of the other disk formats that are out there. It has built-in error checking, so when it gets opened by the software at the other end, at least there's the potential for it to kind of do a self-check and kind of go, oh, I'm good, or oh, I'm corrupted. It includes the gaps, it includes the metadata, it includes the ISRC codes. I think it's a sound format to use. People can use it to export 16-bit files that I send a player out to them that allows them to open it and preview it and burn CDs and export the files. So they can use that. They can submit those to everywhere except iTunes, and they can ask me if they want 24-bit files for the iTunes or for the vinyl. So that's the way that I do it.
Okay.
But yet again, that kind of comes from a place of being a paranoid control freak.
That's the only reason I ask.
Prerequisite of being a mastering engineer, probably.
The only reason I ask is just because I like if you're working with kind of independent artists who are going to sort of do the digital distribution themselves, you don't. If you're using something like DistroKid or TuneCore or whatever, you don't get the option to send like a separate version to iTunes. It just all kind of goes up. So, you know.
Some of them do, because some of them do if it's a mastered for iTunes version.
Oh, okay.
Right. So Apple have this, but in order to do that, you need to be a mastered for iTunes certified engineer. In theory, and all it really means is that somebody submitted at least a 24-bit file. So it's not really. It's kind of I think it's a bit of a red herring, but CD Baby certainly, if you pay them a little bit extra, will submit a separate mastered for iTunes file.
Okay.
And I don't give this stuff out in public, but for you guys in the course, if any of you are interested in becoming Master for iTunes certified mastering engineers, drop me a message and I can give you the contact to get the ball rolling on that at least. But it's I've been asked twice in the last eight years whether I was Master for iTunes certified or not. I don't think it really is significant, but it's a variable that's out there. So yeah, and the thing is, I think 1644 sounds absolutely fine. The only difference between 2444 or whatever is this slightly different noise floor. Not convinced that anybody can reliably hear the differences with that. I am convinced that you can hear the difference between a properly dithered 16-bit file and a truncated 16-bit file, but it's not always blatantly obvious. So yeah, I think making an MP3 from a 1644 file is fine. Makes perfect sense to me. At some point, I'll probably move to 24 when I'm confident that it's not going to be mangled further down the processing chain. But it's not very high on my list of priorities.
Cool. Thanks.
No, it's a pleasure. Dull answer for it. It wasn't a dull question. It was a perfectly reasonable question, and I'm sure but in fact, it's a very common question. I keep getting it asked all the time, so I should probably try and think of putting some piece of content that kind of explains it quickly and clearly for people. Because
there's not that many of this like aspects to this that I get genuinely confused about. And this just sends me around in circles for some reason.
Well, I think it's because there's no right answer. In theory, the encoders should all accept 24-bit files, so that should be fine. But in practice, maybe they do, maybe they don't. And I just don't want to run the risk that somebody does a bad quality sample rate conversion, because you can have if somebody does it the wrong way, you can get a shockingly bad sample rate conversion, and then they truncate it, and then they submit it, and it goes through this horrible thing and gets mangled further. So yeah, it's all about control for me. Control as much as you can.
Cool.
Good. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions in the comments, and that's almost an hour and a half. So good. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here and for your questions. Great questions make for a great Q&A. And what day of the week is it? Yeah, there'll be a new video coming, winging its way out to you in a couple of days. So till then, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Ian. Cheers.
See ya.